Okay, so I'm going to begin by just doing a really brief review to get us back into the mindset of personality theories. So I'm not going to go through these each individually, but just kind of try to refresh you a little bit. So we start out with trait theories. The people that we look at here is Carl Jung, who came up with the notion of introvert versus extrovert, also came up with a whole bunch of other things like archetypes and collective unconscious. Probably one of the most, he's a neo-Freudian, so a lot of his ideas start with Freud but kind of branch left or right, mostly left if you're looking at it from that perspective. Eisnick, we don't talk a lot about except for the fact that he was one of the first people to really start to lump traits into types, but then we get into Cattell, and we get into source traits versus surface traits. Source traits are the things inside you that kind of lead to surface traits, and that notion, while Cattell was post-Freud, this idea helps us to understand where Freud is coming from. Freud was not the best person at explaining his ideas. He assumed that if you didn't understand them, then you weren't going to be smart enough to apply them anyway, so he didn't want you to understand them. Very egocentric. But in reality, a lot of contemporary people feel the same way. You know, there are doctors who absolutely loathe things like WebMD because people get a little bit of information and misapply it in a certain way, and all of a sudden things go, off the rails. Or like mechanics probably hate YouTube videos of people trying to fix their car because people watch the video, try to fix their car, and now they have like 4 things wrong with it rather than just one. So Freud's notions were not all that far off from how we are today, but it helps when we start to be able to build up to his ideas. And Cattell was also the person that gave us the 16PF, which was this assessment that had 16 different binary factors that we could look at, and then came up with the Big Five, which again, if you are going into business or you're going into management, even like nursing, if you're going into nurse management, if eventually you want to go ahead and get your bachelor's and your master's and you want to become a nurse manager, knowing about the Big Five is going to be critical because most HR people, most managers talk about the Big Five extensively. So knowing what these are all about is really helpful if you want to become a manager. So let's now talk about Freud. Okay, psychoanalytic theory, pretty much Freud gets to dominate this all by himself. There are neo-Freudians, there are other people that will kind of add to the equation, but this is essentially Freud's seminal work. This is what he's really best known for in a positive way. He's also known for some of his more crackpot ideas, but the psychoanalytic theory is something that we hold on to as mental health professionals. So first off, we have to do a little bit of history of Freud. We know Freud is not a trained psychologist because he predates psychology. He was a trained neurologist, a general practitioner who studied neurology as more of a specialty. It wasn't until he went to a conference in his early career that looked at hypnosis that he actually switched over to be this new field of psychology and psychoanalysis. We've already talked about Jung being one of his early students. Adler, if you know, the Professional School of Psychology in Chicago is named after Alfred Adler. So well-known people followed Freud. But we have to remember that back in this time, you didn't go to classes like you go to classes now. When you were a student of Freud, you were not a student of psychology. You were not a student of psychoanalysis. You were actually a student of Freud. And Freud would assign you the books that he wants you to read. A lot of them were ones that he had written. He would lecture about things that he believed, not necessarily scientific. You were a student you were a Freudian. You were a neo-Freudian when you left his training. And this is very different from today because when you come to class, you don't have to just believe what I'm telling you. You have textbooks, you have other resources, you have the internet, you have your own research. And if I were to give you a test in which I tested you on things that I told you, but you knew through your own research to be wrong, you would then take that to, the deans, the chancellors, and say, Mitchell is teaching us some crap that just makes no sense when you look into it. And I would be the one who would be changed or dismissed. Back in Freud's time, what Freud said, and what all the teachers at that time said, was the truth. If you didn't like it, once you left, you could yourself become a teacher and develop people underneath you. And that's what Adler and Jung did and many other people. But as you were listening, there was no questioning Freud or people of his time. There was no, this doesn't sound right. Where's your research to back that up? It was much more philosophy than it was science. And there's positives and negatives to this, because it allowed people to really explore ideas, really in depth, without being pigeonholed by having to reprove a theory over and over. But from a scientific perspective, this is a really bad idea. If I were to, right now, one of the more popular pseudoscientific notions that is crawling around the internet is absolutely one of my favorites, and that is the Flat Earth Society. How many of you have heard of this? The Earth is flat. It's not a globe. We are surrounded on a flat Earth by a giant wall of ice that the governments are keeping us from, so we don't know that we're on a flat Earth. And then there are some more theories that I think are more tongue-in-cheek, that like the flat Earth sits on the back of a turtle. Where does that turtle sit on the back of a turtle? And okay, so what's at the bottom? It's all turtles. I don't know how much science is in that, but if I were appointed the head of astronomy, I always say that one backwards, astronomy for Ivy Tech, and we were back in the late 1800s, and I believed in flat Earth, that's what everybody leaving Ivy Tech would believe in, flat Earth. You may not believe in it, but on the test, you put that we are living on the back of turtles. So it allowed for people to learn one thing and then decide, critically think about it, and decide afterwards that they wanted to go a different way, which I think created more critical thinkers, but it also created some people who just went with Freud's idea and probably did a little bit of harm to people. But we don't really know what the outcomes were. We just know that academia has changed, and we are expected to teach best practices, best ideas. Okay, so we look at Freud's ideas today from a historical perspective and how it applies to today's psychology and today's psychiatry. All right, and so one of Freud's biggest ideas, and at the time it really wasn't a big idea. Freud was really kind of dismissive about this notion. And before we get into this, we have to remember, we have to go back to chapter 4, I believe. We have consciousness. Remember that? And we mostly talked about altered states of consciousness, being asleep, being intoxicated. But in that lecture, I dropped a seed, and I talked about the unconscious and the subconscious. And it really didn't apply that much at the time, but today it does. You have levels of consciousness right now. You have your conscious mind, which is what you're thinking about. Most of you are looking at the screen. You're listening to my voice. You are writing things down. That is in your conscious mind. Then you have your unconscious. And then you also have your subconscious. Okay? Your subconscious is more like the pre-consciousness. Subconscious is something that is going on underneath your consciousness, and you get the effect of it. You don't really get to touch it. You don't get to think about it directly, but you get the effect of it. So subconsciously right now, you may be thinking, or even maybe unconsciously, you may be hungry. And it's causing you not to be able to pay attention in class. You may not realize what it is that's causing you not to be able to pay attention, but it's sending you indicators that it's hurting you in your ability to pay attention. Okay? So, in this conscious sphere, and trust me, don't spend today trying to philosophically figure out conscious, subconscious, and unconscious. It is a weekend event where you're going to give yourself a headache. Because the question will ultimately come up, if there are things that are unconscious and subconscious to me, who actually knows those things? They affect me. They cause my consciousness to do weird things, but I don't know them. So who is it inside of my body or in my mind that does know it? Is there a second me in there that has more information about me than I know? And if so, why can I not get that information? And then you start getting a headache. So don't do that right now. But we'll talk about the id, the ego, and the superego. And this was Freud's way of breaking out why we do what we do. Okay? The id is based upon what we call the pleasure principle. The id is all about satisfying desires. It is totally unconscious. When you have an urge to do something, Freud says that is your id coming out. And unfortunately, your id is not affected by your ego or superego very much. Your id is pure desire. It wants whatever it wants now, and it wants it in abundance. Okay? So let me give you all three of them, and then I'll start to describe how these interplay with each other. Okay? The ego is the mediator. Okay? So don't get, I'm going to flip back, don't worry, but I'm going to show you the superego first because it makes more sense to show you that than the ego. Okay? So I'll flip back to this one. But so your id is desire, pleasure. Superego is the judge or the censor for bad thoughts, bad ideas. Okay? So the superego comes from a place of morality. Your guilt. Anytime you feel guilt or you feel guilty, that is your superego because your superego has lost and the id has won. Okay? So, you have your id, all pleasure. Superego, all morals, ethics, what you ought to do. Okay? I'm going to flip back. So again, I'll show you, I'll put all these up. The ego is the mediator. It is partially conscious. You know what you ought to do, and partially unconscious because your id and your superego are trying to tell you what it is that they want you to do. So if the superego works on the morality, the what you ought to do, and the id works on the pleasure, what I want to do, the ego works on the reality principle. What I want to do in light of what I should be doing. Okay? Easy way to think about this. I think everybody in this room has seen The Simpsons before, right? If not, you know what I'm talking about with The Simpsons. When Homer has something that he needs to contemplate, whether he should go to Moe's after work or go home and see Marge, what shows up on his shoulders? Little angel, little devil. The little devil is your id. Go to Moe's, have some beers. Marge won't care. Superego, angel. You shouldn't do that. That's a waste of money. You know that you get drunk and you don't go home after a while, and you should go home and see your family. So Homer becomes the ego. And the ego must make a decision that will please both. Now, you're never going to please both. If you give in an inch to one, the other one is losing. It's a zero-sum game. Okay? If you suppress your id too much, you become neurotic. You begin thinking about it. It becomes an obsession. If you suppress your superego too much, that's when guilt comes out. And that's another form of neurosis, where you're feeling too guilty. So what the ego must do is figure out a way to make this work. So the ego might say, we'll stop for one beer, we're going to walk in and tell everybody we're here for one beer, and then we have to go home. Or, I'm not going to go to Moe's tonight, I'll go on Friday, and I'll make sure that I tell Marge that that's what I'm doing. Or, I'll stop and get a 6-pack of beer on the way home, and I'll drink it at home. These are all compromises. The id is hearing all this, and what's weird is I'm talking as if you have 3 different things inside of your body. And according to Freud, you kind of do, because your ego is saying, dude, we'll get you some beer, you'll be able to chill out, and the id is like, no, I want to go to Moe's, I want to go to Moe's now, and we're going to stay there, and we're going to get blackout drunk, and this is going to be awesome. And the superego is saying, no, you shouldn't do that, shouldn't do that. We need to just go home and be a good person, okay? When the ego wins, we don't have neurosis, we don't have bad thoughts either way. We kind of compromise, okay? You all do this all the time. I need to study for my exam next week, but somebody just invited me out to go do something I'd really like to do. Who's saying to stay home and study? Superego. Who's saying go out? Id. So you, ego, must direct the energies and try to make this work. If you stay home and study every night from here until the day you graduate, your id is going to explode. You ever heard of somebody who's kind of cooped themselves up for a really long time and then they finally get out? Maybe somebody who's been in a very domineering marriage and then they get out and what happens?
Go wild.
Yep, they go wild. That's the id coming out to play. Now, you should never, ever, ever meet your id. Your id is suppressed in your unconscious, and God help you if you ever actually have your id come out to play. We only see the id come out to play in one very small population of people. Anybody take a guess what this population is? Psychopaths. Yeah. These are people where their id is, I want to kill as many people as I want to sexually assault people that I want. I would argue that at some point, a person like Harvey Weinstein's id was hanging out because of some of the things that have been reported that he did. Again, I don't know exactly what happened, but his id seemed to be out and about just a little bit. So when we look at these things, we see that when things go wrong, we have these consequences, okay? The 2 parts of the superego are the conscience and the ego ideal. The conscience is telling you what you shouldn't do because it's wrong. Wrong in the respect that you'll be punished for it. The ego ideal is slightly different. It still knows you shouldn't do it, but it's kind of the mother in your ear, okay? It reflects what mom would say if you did this. So if you're sitting in a classroom, if you're taking your final exam and your instructor walks out, what keeps you from copying off the person next to you? Morals?
Nothing.
So is it that? Well, if the superego is working,
just kidding.
Your conscience, and I know, your conscience is thinking, I should not do this. Because not only will I be punished, but my parents would think bad of me. The ego ideal would also be thinking the same thing, but it's more about how I look to myself, because I don't want to lose out. Okay? Now, the superego is the one part that can be negated completely. If there's no option by which the superego can step up and make a good argument. For example, if you have 3 children at home, no money, and you're at the store and you see, a loaf of bread and some meats, and you just grab them and walk out the door, okay? The id is saying, why didn't you grab more? You need food, grab some cheese and some desserts and some Twinkies. We just need everything. Just fill the cart and let's run. The ego is saying, yes, we need these things, and it's kind of waiting for the superego to step in. But think about it. If you are really starving, truly starving, you and your children are starving, the superego really doesn't have much to say, because it's going to say, you ought not steal, But the superego also is at least somewhat cognizant of the fact that if I don't eat today, I'm going to die. Therefore, the superego kind of just shuts up in those situations. And so people will do immoral things when the superego shuts itself down for some reason. And a lot of times this is those crimes, those acts of passion. Really good older book and movie was in the 1990s, A Time to Kill. Has anybody seen this movie before? It's a John Grisham.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, it's about a down south in the 80s, a young black girl in a very segregated and racist town is raped by a couple of white supremacists.
And
Beat her to a pulp. They go in and they're basically kind of let off the hook by the judicial system. So their dad, the child's dad, shoots them both. And really, a lot of people, his lawyer asks him, do you feel bad about this? Would you do it again? He's like, yes, I would do it again. I don't feel bad about it. The superego would normally say, don't kill other people, but, I can put myself in that situation. If people did that to my daughter, there's going to be a comeuppance. I would hope my superego would tell me that, that situation is not going to make it any better, but think about it. Your brain, your superego will sometimes shut down in those situations, and you'll do things that your id is telling you, I want vengeance for this. And the superego has really a hard time saying, no, you shouldn't. So sometimes the superego will step down and not really put up a really good fight. So, need to go back?
Yeah.
Again, if somebody reminds me at the very end of class, I can post this if you don't want to ruin your wrists. I know some of you like to write, helps you with remembering, so either way.
I can always get the rest from her if she's got it, if everybody else is done.
Teamwork. And I can always go back for it if you want. Okay, so we've already talked about this a little bit, but here's the formality of the levels of awareness according to Freud. We have conscious, preconscious, which was also called subconscious and unconscious. So conscious is what you're thinking of at this very moment. Okay? You're consciously thinking about the word conscious. Somewhat redundant, but you're thinking about, you're hearing, it's the things, if we go back to memory, this is the things that are in your sensory and short-term memory. It's what you're thinking about, okay? Your preconscious are the things that are relatively accessible. You can get to them quickly. If I were to ask you where you parked your car, or what color shoes you're wearing, or your significant other's middle name. Okay, none of those things are in your consciousness right now, but they're in your preconscious. That you can get to them without digging really far, and you have access to them. So our memory, our long-term memory, is in preconscious. Okay, and I would also, subconscious and preconscious are interchangeable in some respects, and in other respects they're not. But I would say that your subconscious, that's where your long-term memories are too, because they have an effect on your consciousness at all times. So your long-term consciousness, the things that are in subconscious are not accessible. Preconscious, they're there and they're ready for you to be able to use. And your unconscious is everything that you don't have access to. It's repressed memories and emotions, things that you don't want to think about, but things that are going to drive your id, okay? And so when we talk about repressed memories and emotions, I'm not necessarily talking about bad memories. We think about repressed memories as like, assaults or things that you want to not think about. But repressed memories can also be things that you want to try to not think about because you're trying to actively do something different. Let's say that you're trying to have a better diet. Okay? So you go out for dinner and it's one of your favorite restaurants, and you get something healthy for your course, your main course, and then they come out and say, would you like any desserts? And you're trying to repress how much you like one of their desserts, okay? Your id is going to take that and scream up and down, I want this, I want this, I want this, I want this. Your superego is going to say, no, 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 we're trying to cut back on our sugars and our calories. And your ego is going to try to basically mediate between those two. Most of the time, when you're in the first stages of trying to make a behavior modification, your superego is going to win. You're going to say, no, I'm not having any dessert tonight. But then after a week or two, your id unconsciously just keeps grating at you. You want a Twinkie. You want some chips. You want a beer. You want whatever it is. And it's just kind of hitting at you all the time. This is why. How many smokers do I have in here? How many people have tried?
Smoke anymore.
You don't smoke anymore. Do you still smoke?
Yes.
Have you tried to quit?
I quit for 3 years and started again.
Okay. You smoked and quit?
Yeah.
Okay. How long?
A few times.
Okay, see, multiple times. And that's the same thing. Okay, so when you quit smoking, it was a conscious decision. No more smoking. Cigarettes down. Okay? And then in your preconscious, every time that you got into a situation that you would have normally smoked, you probably thought about it, but you really didn't think about it. Like you started reaching for your cigarettes. Like when you walked out the door from work, if that was a time that you normally smoked, you would start to grab for it. Like, oh wait, no, conscious, I'm not smoking. But underneath, every second, your id was saying, don't you want to smoke? Hey, there's something we're missing here. What is it? Oh yeah, smoking. Let's smoke. And right now, since you actively smoke, I'm probably driving you insane right now saying this over and over. But your unconscious is telling you, it doesn't necessarily have to come out front. Addictions work this way. They stay in the unconscious, and then when you hit a trigger, they come up to your preconscious or conscious. Yeah. And so you get stressed, and I normally reacted to stress to that, and I smoked. So it's always down in here, and you're repressing it. You're repressing that this is what I used to do, and that's going to drive the id. So how do we finally get away from it? Well, after enough time, let's go back to that term that we had in sensation perception. Your id somewhat habituates to the notion that you crave this thing, but you're not going to get it. Remember habituation? It's the sound of this. Until I said it, you didn't hear it, and now you hear it. Kind of the same thing with your id. Your id is screaming for a cigarette. Your id is screaming for sugar. Your id is screaming to go gamble, to snort cocaine, whatever it is. And eventually, the id is just like, this ain't happening. But we know spontaneous recovery can happen, and it just comes into your consciousness, and that's where you pick it up again. So these are all of our levels of awareness. And they all have an impact on what we do. So your ego is almost all conscious. Okay? Your superego is somewhat conscious. It's because you can let out into the world what you ought to do. This is what I call today, this is a relatively new term, virtue signaling. Virtue signaling, you may have heard of this. It's where people agree with other people on like social media, or they copy and paste a post on their Facebook or Twitter. It's like the Me Too campaign, but the Me Too campaign really isn't virtue signaling so much. But it's saying that it's wearing like the ribbon on your car or your shirt. It's your superego coming out saying, I support these things, this is a good thing. But most of the time you're just seeing your ego, the mixture of your superego and id. You will notice that your id is buried even deeper than just the line of preconscious. We don't want to see that thing. To see your id, we would see the Tasmanian devil of whatever it is you desire. If you desired candy, you would just be eating everything. And your id doesn't care about the future, nor does it respect the past. Because if your id takes over and you're like, I want cheesecake, I love cheesecake, if the ego wins, you might be like, okay, I'll have one piece of cheesecake and that's it. If your id comes out, you're going to put your face in the cheesecake and eat it like a dog. You're just going to be shoveling it in your mouth. And even though you know that after eating one cheesecake, your stomach is going to hurt like the devil, and tomorrow you're going to have the revenge from hell when you go to the restroom, your id is going to say, that cheesecake was good, let's go for number 2. It doesn't care about you in the future. Your id is probably the reason that you at one time or another have gone shopping, and when you got home, you look at everything in the bags and say, what was I thinking? It happens. Happens all the time. The id is the reason why you're never supposed to go grocery shopping on an empty stomach. Because your id's like, I want that, I want to eat that, I want to eat that, I want to eat that. If you go grocery shopping on a full stomach, your id is like, oh, I'm not all that hungry. This is not appeasing to me. This is not appealing. Do what you want. So your id is very childlike in the respect that it just wants what it wants and doesn't care about the consequences. If it wants to go buy a new car, it doesn't matter if those payments are too much, and you'll probably end up losing, you can't pay the rent on your house. Mm-hmm. It doesn't care. And that's what a lot of salespeople really bank on. They play to your id. Isn't this car sexy? Isn't this car awesome? Isn't it fast? Would you feel great in this car? And your id is like, hell yeah, I do. And your superego is screaming, no, we can't afford an $1,100 payment. It's a lease too. You won't even get anything. But you're sitting there going, yeah, this is me. And your id, if your id wins, then your ego has to deal with it. And your ego's like, great, we're taking out a third job. Great, we're going to have to sell blood. Great, we're going to have to sell bone marrow or a kidney. Your ego is always that, wah, wah, okay, I'll deal with this. And if the ego gives up, the superego really has no power against the id. And that's when things spiral out of control. So what happens with these things? We have neurotic and moral anxiety. Neurotic anxiety, I've already mentioned, is when you have id impulses that the id can't control. You become neurotic. You go to the mall and you see a pair of shoes that you absolutely want, but you know that that's going to take away all your money for the week. You're not going to be able to eat. But the id is making you neurotic, like, I need that, I need those shoes, I need those shoes, I need those shoes, I need those shoes. And so your ego just kind of gives in. It's like, fine, just shut up. It's like the kid checking out at Walmart. That's your id. I want candy, I want a Kit Kat, give me a Kit Kat. And finally, like, you are the ego. It's like, fine, just take it. Moral anxiety. Moral anxiety, though.
And see what happens.
Yeah. And wouldn't that be nice if you could do that to your id? But your id doesn't care. It's down deep. It's not going to go anywhere.
Is that where they got the term kid from?
Probably. Yeah. If you ask Freud would say absolutely. Yeah, that came from his idea. Moral anxiety comes from the threats of punishment to the superego. So basically, moral anxiety is the superego saying, if you do this, I'm going to make you feel so guilty, so bad. If you walk by, you walk by my desk and sitting there is the answer key for the final and I'm not around, your id is saying, grab it, grab it, grab it, grab it, grab it, grab it, grab it. And so you finally grab it, but the superego is saying, if you do that, man, I'm going to make you feel guilty. I'm going to make you feel so guilty. And so you do it, and the superego is like, okay, fine, I can't do anything else, but I'll still make you feel guilty. And that's where the superego basically tries to get you to correct your actions. And so Freud is really well known for this next section, which is called defense mechanisms. And you're gonna notice some of these are things that you have said or used in the past. You just didn't know that it was Freud. These terms, for these defense mechanisms, are the tools of the ego that are trying to get away from neurotic or moral anxiety. So the decision and the behavior and everything has already happened once these defense mechanisms are kicked in. Just like the anxiety. The anxiety comes not from the thinking about it is the threat of anxiety is what works for moral anxiety, but once it happens, you have that feeling going on. Neurotic anxiety, I can guarantee most everybody can relate to moral and neurotic anxiety. Neurotic anxiety is you want something so bad and you suppress it, but it's stuck in your head. And it's like you can't get it out of your head. You want to buy something, you want to do something, you want to whatever it might be, and you're neurotic. You just think about it constantly. And there's nothing you can do unless you actually stop thinking about it or you succumb to it and the id is satiated for a moment or two before the id comes up with something new that it wants. So these defense mechanisms are how the ego tries to deal with these two different types of anxiety. Okay? Is everybody good? Need a little bit more time?
Need a little more
Push the
time.
button? Okay. Good? We can always move back if we need to. Okay. So here are just some examples of defense mechanisms. And again, don't try to write all these down because we're not going to go through all of them. But I think some of these are ones that you can probably relate to. So regression. The ego seeks the security of an earlier developmental period in the face of stress. You have probably seen when somebody goes through a very traumatic event, they start to act almost childish. You'll see adults who ball up in the fetal position. Or you'll see adults who start to chew on their nails or suck their thumb. You'll see grown men in traumatic experiences calling out for their mom. Or grown women or grown people. They're regressing to an earlier developmental period because they don't know how to deal with this. And the earlier developmental period, somebody else dealt with it for them. Okay? One place that we tend to almost always see this is people who have been sentenced to capital punishment, death row. Almost 75, 80% of the people who go in their last 24 hours, it's reported that they regress during that 24 hours back to a childlike state. They may pull it together before the very end, but they tend to talk and think like children because they're trying to alleviate this fear or anxiety that they're having. Displacement. Displacement is where you shift your unacceptable feelings of one object to another, one that's more acceptable. This would be if you have a really bad day at work, you can't punch your boss, right?
No.
You shouldn't punch your boss, right?
You shouldn't.
Okay. Well, the displacement isn't much better. I'm not encouraging this, but you have somebody who goes home and they punt the dog, or they beat their spouse or their kids. That's displacement. I can't beat up my boss because I'll lose my job, so I'll take it out on somebody else. Now, there are healthy ways of displacement. You get done with your job, you had a bad day, you go to the gym and you punch the heavy bag a little bit. Okay, that's good displacement. You're not really hurting anybody. There are some psychologists that would argue that it's not a good method because all you're doing is learning that the way to get rid of frustration is through violence. And when you don't have a punching bag, you're going to find a human being to replace that. But all in all, if you have to choose, that's a good displacement. Projection. Projection is something we see a ton of today. The ego attributes personal shortcomings to others. That I may have this, but you have this. Okay? I may have a drinking problem, but you don't keep the house clean. It really has nothing to do, A, has nothing to do with B. But you're projecting your shortcomings onto somebody else. We see this a ton with parents and kids. Parents who really haven't fulfilled their life's goals, and so they push and push and push their kids, and when their kids fail, they project their own inadequacies onto their kids and blame them. Rationalization, everybody's done this. This is probably what every police officer hears at least 20 times a day if they're doing street patrol. I was just keeping up with traffic. Other people were going faster than me. Okay? So if I'm doing 75 and a 55 and I get pulled over and everybody was going faster than me, does that mean that I wasn't speeding? No, I was speeding.
you driving a red or yellow car?
It does red probably, so I probably got pulled over for that rationalization. It's because I'm driving a red car. Okay? The ego justifies your unacceptable behavior by giving a acceptable but false reason. Okay? I needed to be speeding because I need to get home. I needed to keep up with the flow of traffic. Nowhere in the driver's manual does it say you must keep up with the flow of traffic. You should if everybody's going the speed limit, but if everybody's doing 75, you don't have to go 75. Okay? So rationalization is something we do to try to protect our own ego. There's other ones too, but there's probably I think about 20 or 25 of these. These are kind of the more interesting ones. Sublimation is one that I think is incredibly intriguing. It's where you take an unacceptable impulse and replace it with a socially acceptable one. So you have an impulse to do something that is unethical, immoral, illegal, and so you replace it with something that is okay to do. So you may have a proclivity for pedophilia. And so you know you can't do that and you shouldn't do that, so you seek out pornographic material in which people look to be young, but they're actually of age. Okay? Neither one of these things are ideal, but you're replacing something completely unacceptable with something that it may not be socially acceptable, but it works. Okay? So again, I may want to beat my boss up, but instead, every Wednesday I go and I train jujitsu and I project that the person that I'm grappling with is my boss. So it's socially acceptable that I can then grapple with somebody. That's sublimation. It's replacing the bad things with the good. Okay? So according to Freud, here's where things get strange. Nicest way I can put it. You're going to start to really question why we even think about Freud when I talk about this. But roll with it. Sometimes this ends up making more sense than what you think it will. Freud believed that our personality is essentially formed by the age of 6. And our personality, our quirks, our issues that come from this personality that is developed is always can be traced back to things of the childhood. And Freud was really big on erogenous zones. Mostly sexual erogenous zones, areas of the body that are capable of producing pleasure. Okay? So we think about areas of the body that are capable of producing pleasure. We think about the mouth where we taste things, the nose where we smell things, the hands that can feel things, and then the genitals and the erogenous zones that tend to bring pleasure out in adults. Freud postulated that we go through 5 distinct stages. And it has a lot to do with different erogenous zones. And if we do not successfully get through one of these successive stages, we will develop a fixation on that erogenous that stems from that erogenous zone, and we'll get hung up emotionally on what's going on there. Okay? So, everything that you have going on in your life, according to Freud, can essentially be traced back to something that happened between the ages of 0 and 6. A lot of people don't like the next section. If we talk about it as Freud put it forth. Okay? What you have to do with this section is you have to remember the time in which Freud was talking, the misogynistic mentality that people of his time had, the lack of certain understandings of neurology and lifespan development. You have to take that into account and accept that some of his ideas seem a little bit off. However, the underlying principles may not be perfectly logical, but they help us make sense of certain ideas in lifespan development. Okay? So, we're going to look at the different stages of personality development according to Freud, and these are mostly sexual in nature. Okay? So immediately you should be thinking, wait, 0 to 6 in sexual, something is amiss here. And it is. This is why you have to kind of translate things in your head as we're talking about these things. Okay? So, the oral stage. Again, don't try to write all this stuff down. It's too much. Unless you need to, then go for it. The oral stage, ages 0 to 1. Okay? Think about the first year of a child's life. Think about the first week of a child's life. What is it doing? It's sleeping, it's waking up, it's screaming, it's getting fed, it's going back to sleep. Okay? So the infant's pleasure comes from the stimulation of the mouth. It screams, it gets fed. It gets mom's breast, or it gets the artificial nipple. Somehow its mouth is being satiated. Okay? And so if this child is not satiated in an appropriate way, the child may develop an oral-dependent personality. Oral-dependent meaning that it's fixated on the mouth because mom or dad or wet nurse or whatever it is did not give the child enough attention during the ages of 0 to 1. And so an oral-dependent personality, an oral fixation, needs lots of attention. Fixations create oral aggressive adults who like to argue and exploit others. So if you think about a child who's not getting their oral fixation met at the ages of 0 to 1, how are they going to sound? What's that child going to sound like? I bring in a 6-month-old that hasn't been fed in 12 hours. What do you expect to hear?
Screaming.
Screaming, okay? So the oral-dependent personality likes to argue and exploit others. They've learned that the more they scream, eventually they end up getting their way. They may need to scream a lot, but eventually it works out for them, okay? So the erogenous zone is the mouth. You've heard of oral fixations before, right? Oral fixations, Freud would say that if a mom or dad or caregiver used some type of device to suppress the oral outburst, that an oral fixation may occur. That as they're screaming, you put a bink in their mouth, or you put food in their mouth that's excess to what they need. Then the child may become orally fixated. When they start to feel anxious, they'll want to put something in their mouth. What groups of people do we think may be orally fixated? Front row. Oral fixation. Smokers. That's one thing that people will say, I have an oral fixation, and it's because I need to have something. Sometimes people who constantly have to have gum or suckers or constantly drinking something, you can have an oral fixation. This is Freudian. I'm not saying this is the reason. But the next one is the most bizarre one, but it actually, in my mind, makes a ton of sense. The anal stage. Between the ages of 1 and 3, what is a huge milestone that happens during that age?
Potty trained.
You teach a kid to be potty trained, right? So, during the anal stage, kids start to develop this idea that before the age of 1 or before potty training begins, kids don't really feel discomfort when it comes to excreting their bowel movements. Because when they feel something, they do it, right? As adults, we've just gotten kind of used to the fact that by retaining, and again, hopefully it's not lunch right after this, but by retaining feces, it is an uncomfortable thing for humans to do, but we've learned that it's something that we have to do, and so we kind of get sensory adapted to it. It's not normally a real painful thing unless something has gone wrong. So to teach a child to make them be uncomfortable for short amounts of time, there has to be a payoff. There has to be something that they get. A lot of times, when my daughter was potty trained, we used the M&M method. She goes on the potty, she goes pee, she gets 1 M&M, she does a number 2, she gets 2 M&Ms. Okay? She learned how to be potty trained relatively quickly because she liked M&Ms. We had to wean her off of that because at the age of 18, I don't want her coming up to me and asking for M&Ms after she goes to the bathroom. That would just be weird. But I know that she had to be uncomfortable in order to do that because it's uncomfortable to try to hold something like that in. So Freud postulated that people who got through this appropriately were going to be normal going forward. But I'm sure you've heard of anal retentive people before. Anal retentive people are stubborn, stingy, orderly, compulsively clean. Think about the child who realizes that having feces in their diaper is actually a dirty thing. First year or two of your life, the kid has no idea what's going on. They don't know. But eventually they start to realize, wait a second, they're always cleaning me off when this happens. That's a bad thing. It's stinky. And so instead of just retaining it and getting it out on the toilet, some kids become really anal retentive, and they're just going to hold that stuff in because they want to be compulsively clean. You've probably seen somebody who's anal retentive, somebody who dusts their house every day, vacuums twice a day, everything is meticulous. That's because, theoretically by Freud, they did not get through this normal progression, and they were either harshly criticized or punished when they made a mess. So they're anal retentive because cleanliness is good. The anal expulsive is the exact opposite. They actually learn that being disorderly and messy and destructive and cruel gets them attention. If the parents only responded when the kid blew out a diaper, then they might become anal expulsive and they try to create messes, both metaphorically and real messes, so that they get attention. Okay? This, again, anal retentive is kind of like a precursor. It's not the same thing, but it's like an OCD-ish type thing. People who need to have meticulously clean homes or rooms. Everything has to be in order. That's the anal retentive, the anal expulsive. And this all stems from how mom and dad treat potty training. Okay?
Just potty training.
Pretty
Nothing
much.
More, nothing less. Just potty training.
Pretty much. Again, this is very narrow scoped. But really,
this is all according to him.
This is Freudian, yes. And so this is I would say this is a part of a well-balanced breakfast. Okay? If you just eat this by yourself, then no, you're not getting how lifespan development works. But is this a part? I really think that probably does fit somewhat. That if you have a parent who's just obsessed about cleanliness, that probably starts, the first time that the kid probably notices is during potty training. That, if mom is changing your diaper and constantly checking and constantly trying to put you on the toilet to make it go to the right place, that may create an anal retentive kid. If the only way that you can get mom and dad's attention is by blowing out the diaper the third time and it's coming out all over, might create an anal expulsive child that, will throw that tantrum in the middle of Target to try to get mom and dad to get attention. So again, this is not a standalone. Freud would say it's a standalone. Freud would say, okay, so you are stubborn and compulsively clean, then you must have had some problems with potty training. I think it's part of the issue. It's not the whole thing. Okay? So we go to the next stage, which is the phallic stage. So if you can stomach the anal stage, this one becomes a little more problematic when you think about it in depth, but it's not nearly as difficult to just think about as the anal stage. The phallic stage is between the ages of 3 and 6. And here's where we get into some of Freud's most notorious, well-known, and misinterpreted theories. Okay? At ages 3 to 6, the child is aware that there's a difference between boys and girls. Now, we're not getting into gender here. That's a completely different conversation. We are talking about XY versus XX, innie versus outie, penis versus vagina. That's the only difference we're talking about here. Okay? So children realize that there is a difference between males and females. And Freud came up with this notion that there is something called an Oedipus complex. And hang on just a second, I'm going to flip right back, and I want to make sure Okay, yeah. So this Oedipus complex stems from the fact that boys feel dominant to girls at this stage. And girls, at the age of about 3 to 4, start to notice that they are missing something. You know, it's not uncommon for 4, 5, 6-year-old boys and girls to play doctor or play show me mine, I'll show you, and they start to realize that, hey, there's something different. Well, according to Freud, girls notice that they are missing something, and they develop something, and ladies, you're going to love this one. They develop penis envy. And penis envy stems from what he called castration anxiety, that these little girls look at the boys, look at themselves, and say, Jesus, there's something missing here. Somebody must have cut it off. And so they develop penis envy, and they look to their mom and dad, and they notice, well, mom's a girl, she must be missing this thing, so she must be the weaker of the two, because somebody castrated her. So, you know what? She's not really worth my time right now. And they develop what's called the Oedipus complex, the girls develop the Electra conflict. The Electra conflict is that they love their father, but mom is competing, so the girl begins to kind of push away from mom because she's competing for dad's attention. The Oedipus complex is that the boy feels a rivalry with his father for mom's affection. What's happening, usually before the age of 3, but remember, in Freud's time, this was going on ages 3, 4, maybe 5 or 6. What's happening? What kind of feeding is going on for young boys? They're still being breastfed. You know, late 1800s, early 1900s, it was not uncommon for a boy at the age of 5 to still be breastfed. But they start to notice, wait a second, dad seems to be interested in mom, and possibly has even noticed, wait a second, dad seems to be interested in those breasts. And those are mine. That's where I get my lunch. That is my mom. He shouldn't be touching her in that way. And so he developed, according to Freud, the young boy will develop the Oedipus conflict, in which he gets a big rivalry for his father, and he is also afraid of castration, because if he's seen a girl, he knows that this is possible, that if dad wants to take me out and make me not a competition for mom, what if he just castrates me? Again, kids don't think things through very much, and I don't think Freud ever said kids are sitting at home at night under the covers afraid dad's going to cut off their willy. It's more of just a subconscious thing that boys are afraid of the dominance of dad, and so they tend to seek out the protection of mom. Okay? Again, hard to really get your head wrapped around until you start to see kids go through something similar, and you can kind of pinpoint, it's like, wait a second, yeah, so the boys are kind of buddying up with mom at this time, and the girls are kind of buddying up with dad, and this doesn't explain it per se, but it is one, I'm not going to say rational, it is one explanation. Freud came up with an explanation as to why this is happening, and it fits a lot of the parameters of personality development, okay? And then at the age of 6 or 7, probably a little bit earlier nowadays, because we're developing quicker, we go into latency. And latency is essentially a lack of development psychosexually, according to Freud. After 6, we get through our Oedipus complex, we get through our Electra complex, and psychosexual development is dormant. We start to see more same-sex relationships happening, boys kind of sectioning off with boys, girls sectioning off with girls. This flies in the direct conflict to what's been proposed in the last 5 years. And in the last 5 years, there's been this huge push towards gender discussion and gender decision by children. That there's a lot of people who are advocating for allowing children between the ages of 6 and 12 to make a decision that they are a different gender than what they are sexually assigned at birth. And again, I don't know that this really helps the argument one way or the other, but Freud would say that this is complete bunk, because this is latency. They're not able to make a decision because they don't understand the difference between genders. And they don't understand what's going on with sex. And they really, because they haven't experienced puberty, they don't really know what it's like to be a boy or girl. They only know the phenotypical, the look, this is how girls look, and I like to play with girls' toys, but it doesn't mean that you know what it's like to feel like a girl or a boy in the post-pubescent world. And so, while I don't think anybody's jumping up and down saying, well, Freud said we shouldn't do this, a lot of people are looking at Freud and a lot of other people's notions and saying, you know, we're dancing with the devil when we're allowing a 7-year-old to make a decision to go on to puberty blockers, to take hormones that will stop puberty and allow them to make a gender decision before they've ever hit puberty. The argument against that is, how would they ever know until they hit puberty what it's like to be a man or a woman? It's only based upon their particular interpretation and what they've been exposed to. They don't have true information. Now, I'm not saying that this is a bad idea. I'm not saying it's a good idea, but we don't have a lot of science on this. We have a lot of feelings. We have a lot of people who say one thing or the other, but we don't know what the true effect of these things are. We're for lack of a better term, we're using these children as guinea pigs to see how it works. Will it work out? I'm really hoping so. I hope that these kids are not harmed by this. Is there a possibility? Absolutely, because we just don't know what we're doing to people. But for the most part, when people just develop naturally, when nothing artificial is put in, the genital stage is when puberty kicks in. Okay, so for girls, this is called menarche, the first time that she will have her period. For boys, there's not really a definitive moment when we know they've hit puberty, but you just kind of know. Like one night they go to sleep, the next day they wake up and they have, they've grown 6 inches, their voice is squeaking, and then it sounds like Barry White, and they have a fresh crop of artificial freckles all over their face. So you just kind of realize that's what's happening. They hit their growth spurt. For girls, it's much more concrete. It's normally when menarche hits, although we are starting to see something called pseudomenarche, where girls will have everything that looks like their first period, but they won't release an egg, so it's not technically menarche. They haven't hit puberty, but their bodies, because of possibly hormones or artificial elements, is telling them, hey, it's time for you to start doing this, but their body doesn't actually release the egg. And a lot of people attribute that to GMOs, artificial testosterone in meats. We don't know why it's happening, but we just know that it is happening. And for the most part, people don't know when it's happening because they don't get it tested. They just figure, well, it looks and feels like a period, so therefore we'll just treat it like that. They only look into it when it's way too early. Okay. What we know about Freud is that he way overemphasized sex in the child's experience. We don't take Freud verbatim today. We take him as we can interpret him, which is cool because he's dead. If he were alive, he wouldn't want anybody interpreting his stuff. He would want to say, I said what I said and I meant it. Freud, the reason that we can manipulate his theories is because they weren't scientific in nature. They were philosophical. And, there's no way to test the unconscious. We can look for evidence of the unconscious and the subconscious, but we can't test it. We can't pull it out and manipulate it and play with it. We just have to say that we believe that it is there. It is something that we think is having an impact on the human, but we just don't absolutely know. It's very similar in philosophical or theological realms to the human soul. Some people who are religious believe that you have a soul, but that's not scientific. Just because someone dies and the meat machine is left behind and we don't know what happens to the inner dualistic world doesn't necessarily mean that the soul must occur, but it is one explanation. Just like Freud's, most everything he did, even though he was a trained neurologist, he couldn't prove any of his ideas simply because they are unprovable for the most part, and even if he wanted to try to prove them, he didn't have the tools. They knew about basic neurology, but they didn't have fMRIs or EEGs or any way to look at what was going on inside the human body. So it's kind of his get out of jail free card. Even if he wanted to prove some of his ideas in a scientific way, he couldn't. And today, people don't even try because we kind of know that they are philosophical in nature, that they're not scientific in nature. Freud's treatment or fix to all of this is the psychoanalytic or psychotherapeutic treatment model. Psychoanalysis doesn't happen very much anymore in the psychiatric, counseling world for one simple reason. Psychoanalysis takes forever. Psychoanalysis is very effective, but you're looking at a minimum of 6 months just to get the ball rolling, and sometimes 2 or 3 years before you finally dig deep enough to find out what the true problem is. And if you look at counseling today, it's pretty much ruled by one group: secondary payers, insurance, Medicaid, Medicare. And they love to see people in and out 6 to 8 sessions, and boom, you're done. That's their goal. So we have to use things like cognitive behavioral therapy, which doesn't dig deep and find the root cause. It basically it creates an environment where you're able to function even though you still have this issue going on underneath. It's basically the equivalent of putting some Neosporin and Band-Aid on a huge cut versus going in and getting stitches and getting everything put in correctly and finding out what the real problem was. Psychoanalysis is very effective, and it's very, when you get in deep on somebody, you find out what the root cause of a problem is, but most people are not willing to wait that long. The other thing is, and in his time, people were willing to go a couple of years before they could finally get rid of whatever psychological issue was going on, because what did they not have? The thing that we use today for our psychiatric issues. More globally, just psychotropic medications. Yeah. Today, we don't need to get to the root cause of your problem because we can mask it so darn well. Yes, maybe you are feeling anxious and depressed all the time because of the way your mom treated you when you were 7, but here's this pill, and it'll just make you ignore it. So you want to wait 2 years and get to the bottom of it, or you just want to take this and numb yourself out? 99% of people, almost 100% of doctors say, let's numb that sucker. And again, going back to a biological way of looking at something, if I break my leg, you can give me a whole bunch of oxy, or you can set my leg. Yeah, give me enough oxy and I don't care. But is my leg ever going to get any better? No. But am I going to care? No. So it kind of becomes problematic. Okay. I'm going to skip over womb MD because that's just weird. Okay. Unfortunately, that's all that I didn't think we'd take the whole time with Freud, but that's okay.
Post it.
Yeah, I'll post the rest of it so that you have it. I may go slightly into this on Monday, social cognitive and humanistic theories, just because it's gonna piggyback directly into the next section, which is social psychology as a whole. So I said this is part of social psychology, but then we're going to talk next week about true social psychology, the in and of itself. Okay? So won't keep you anymore. If you have any questions, please email me, and I will see you. Shoot, yes. I'll post a video so that you guys know where you're at. And I can send you all emails, too, if you want to know your individual ones.
I don't know if anybody else had any issues, but the video that you sent was actually really
choppy. Yeah, I know. That was my computer, and I tried to fix it, and I couldn't. Let me see if I'll try to re-record it. That way you guys can take a look at it if you need to. But I'll put a video and the numbers up for everybody. I have a number. I have a Excel sheet, but it's not on this computer. It's not on the network. So I'll make sure I get that up.
The numbers, like
just where everybody was and as a class, how you guys did individually. I won't put individuals up for everybody to see, but just the individual breakouts. And then I will be updating your grades probably Friday.
You have mine in there.
I might have some of them in there, but not all.
Yeah, but Fred wasn't.
Okay.